Forward TV. The world is thinking.
Is recycling a waste of time? Recycling is obviously a very topical issue at the moment, with Friends of the Earth commenting not long ago that there is a lot to learn from the developing world, where a scavenger mentality, grassroots recycling and sheer necessity can lead to imaginative leaps in redeploying waste. In complete opposition to that, we had the Council for Packaging and the Environment coming out not long ago, also saying that recycling can be a waste of time and consumers should choose what best suits their needs and not feel guilty about trivial decisions. So I'm sure more than a few of us are a little bit confused about this kind of topic. So to help us decide whether recycling is a waste of time or not, I'd like to introduce you to this afternoon's panel. On my left, we have Tom Deichmann. Thomas is editor-in-chief of the bi-monthly German magazine Novo, published in Frankfurt. Since 1993, he has worked as a freelance journalist and researcher for a number of European papers. Since 1999, he has focused his research and writing specifically on scientific topics and modern biotechnology in particular. On our panel of respondents, I'd like to first introduce you to Julie Hill on my immediate right. Julie is former director of and now associate of the Green Alliance, one of the UK's foremost environmental policy organisations. Her areas of expertise are biotechnology, waste and resource policy, and also sustainable buildings. She's authored and co-authored a number of publications on business and the environment, including a Zero Waste UK. Moving on, I'd like to introduce our second respondent, Julia Hales, in the middle on my right. Julia is author of the New Green Consumer Guide. She advises major corporations such as Procter & Gamble on environmental issues and is also a blogger for the Daily Telegraph. Julia began her career at Earthlife and has since helped to establish organisations such as Sustainability and to organise the Green Consumer Week. Our last respondent is Rob Lyons on the end. Rob is deputy editor of Spiked and his areas of interest include science and health topics, particularly debates around the environment and what to do about waste. This session is going to have one 10-minute talk from Tom Deichmann, who's going to tell us why we shouldn't worry about recycling, and then we're going to have our respondents ask him questions before coming out to the audience. Okay?
Yeah, thank you. I think Martin Earnshaw wrote a very good battle in print, which I want to recommend for reading afterwards if you haven't done it yet, coming to the conclusion that the assumptions about recycling are unsustainable and irreal. Which I think is absolutely true. I brought three things here. This is the first I want to show you. Obviously, the only positive thing I'm going to say about recycling. This is a piece of art done of, how is it called? Cardboard, yeah. Recycled paper. A friend of mine is an artist and he made this fantastic piece of art out of it. It says recycling. Difficult to read, but have a look at it. Maybe you're going to spot it. Now it's getting worse. This is the second example I bring over. I would call it a waste of money and a rip-off. It's done of old plastic. It's a very fashionable label. It's very expensive, and that's the kind of stuff you get today in order to fulfill these mantras. And I brought you a couple of these plastic bags in order to show you how absurd the discussion has become in Germany. This is a paper bag which you get from a bakery shop in Germany. You've got the rolls in, you've got the pretzel in, whatever you got there. And this is a hot political issue in Germany in these days, because it's not clear where you're going to put it in what kind of bin. Because what could happen, of course, it's seen as a paper, you could put it into the paper bin, but at the same time some pieces of the roll could stick in, so maybe organic waste, or if some sausages in, it becomes even more complicated. And at the other side you could say, well, this is a part of package, so put it into the package bin, into the yellow one. And actually this is a kind of problems Germany hasn't spent thousands of euro in the last couple of months for studies, serious studies, how to deal with these kind of questions. And I think it's a very good example to show how absurd the whole discussion on recycling has become. So I'm glad to be here and make some very strong points against this kind of recycle circus, because Germany is, of course, on top of it. We are world champion in recycling, we are world champion in recycling technology, in recycling infrastructure. Actually, Germany has been seen as the avant-garde in all that kind of stuff. It started in 1999 with the first big package of laws in Germany, And then, since then, numerous legislation and laws passed the parliament. And I actually wanted to bring over a couple of documents, but I immediately found out I would have carried over with a lorry. And not only that, I would have brought at least 2 jumbo jets full of experts to explain the ins and outs of all these legislations. So Germany has gone through this whole recycling industry for the last 15 years. And nowadays, not only nowadays, but now it's becoming more and more obvious also in the political arena, that the results are very clear and have been identified by various studies in Germany, in Sweden, in other countries. First of all, compared to other places in the world, Germany in 1999 was a relatively clean country already, and it still is after 15 years of recycling. Cynics say it might have been even better in 1999, and if Germany wouldn't have wasted so much energy and time in this kind of whole industry of recycling, it might be better today. But more importantly, the result is very clear like that. The best you can do as an ordinary citizen today is not to think about waste. Recycling is a waste of time, it's a waste of money, and it's a waste of intellectual or moral, or however you call it, brain energy. The best that happens, and that is shown by various studies, to your waste which you produce at home is being burned. Being burned in modern facilities, of course, not open fires, modern facilities with high-tech filters, where you maybe can even use the energy out of these burning facilities. That is the best for your own soul. This is the best for the environment. This is the best for the economy. This is the best for the society as a whole. And so actually, just now, a couple of months ago, a discussion has started already. Also, this is clear for some years already in Germany, actually to get rid of a very, very expensive and inefficient recycling system. Second point to throw in to clarify my case is I'm a trained civil engineer, so I'm a big fan of efficiency and of optimal solutions for such kind of problems like waste. But what I've learned very quickly when I started writing as a journalist about this subject is that issues like waste management, water supply, or whatever, they are not discussed around the facts, but it's primarily driven by the attempt by political elites or by pressure groups, whatever, to get some messages across. That is a purpose, that is a kind of starting point for many of these discussions we have. And what has happened in recent years that such topics have become highly politicized as well by our elites. And I firmly believe that in a modern civilized world we are living in, actually a citizen should leave it to experts, to engineers, to sort out the waste problem and not spend a single second about thinking about where to put the bin in. Today the opposite happens. We are not the optimal solutions how to deal with waste, and there's a lot of waste management which is only a political campaign but not about technical solutions. So there's another point to make about that. I would also argue that you can leave it to a large extent to the producers itself to come up with clever solutions, with good technical solution, because dealing with waste, dealing with material in a production process is a very big factor, is a very big cost factor. That is actually, to make it frankly clear, that in real programs in terms of waste management, waste reduction, better resource management, did not come from such kind of green interventions like recycling, but it's part and parcel of scientific progress or of technical progress. Packaging is a good example. I think we're going to come back to that later. I don't want to argue against the state encouraging certain developments in terms of how we deal with our resources or how we deal with waste. But to come to my third and my final point, I think we have to be very clear about that. The political circus that has been started in Europe and in Germany 15 years ago about recycling and waste management is not about good, serious, technical, good solutions bringing society forward. It's about educating society. It's about manipulating the public. It's a kind of brainwash attempt by the elites who obviously don't have anything else to offer for a better future. It's about the idea that the elites trying to implant in your brain the idea that the way you deal with your waste at home is actually the central question for humanity in the 21st century, not only for your life, but for the planet Earth and even more. So you are responsible for separating the waste you produced. You terrible consumer, you're to blame for the whole misery. And of course it encourages a lot of very negative things. Talk about the bin police here in Britain. We've got all that. We've got lockable bins, we've got the bin police, we've got video cameras who's gonna watch exactly where you're gonna throw your green bottle in what kind of bin. So it encourages a very negative neighborhood atmosphere, spying out your neighbors. Distrust is part of that whole program. And of course, maybe most importantly, it absolutely refocuses your general outlook in life and the question you should ask. Instead of asking questions, how can we get on in society? How can we get more? How can we increase our living standards? How can we develop society as a whole? You're asked to separate your waste, to wash out your yogurt cup, and make sure your next door neighbor knows exactly how to deal with all these important problems. So this is actually lowering horizons. It has been raised here at the conference already sometimes at its best, I would say. It's a terrible ethic being propagated with this whole circus, and I hope at least Britain will not follow this German mantra. Thank you.
Okay, respondents, there's plenty for you to get your teeth into. Please keep your points as short as possible, because then I can come back and give you another round of questions. Okay, so Julie, would you like to kick off?
Okay, well, thank you, Thomas. I was trying to work out from what you were saying whether you were arguing against the principle of recycling or cyclical resource use, or the experience. Because, of course, the experiences of it are very different in different places, and I don't think anyone would argue that we've got it perfectly done. But, I mean, do you accept that there is any need to cycle resources in our economy, or do you feel that simply using thermal treatment and reaping the energy will always be sufficient, whatever the level of growth of waste and consumption?
Okay, Julia?
Is that as long as we're going to be?
Oh, no, you'll get another round.
Okay.
If you just your first point.
Were you going to go on? No. Okay.
No, I just wondered whether it'd be productive to have the answer, or are we going to a whole
I'll
set
take
of
a row of questions,
okay.
and then
well, I was going to use a little example here, is that if this represents the world and you've got all the sort of minerals and metals within it, it's quite easy to see that there is a limited amount of minerals and metals within this jar. And obviously, you know, you might feel that you want to do what perhaps Thomas thinks we should be doing, is just chuck it all away like that. But you might also think that that would be rather wasteful, because then there's nothing left. Now, it's not just that it's going to run out in terms of the resources, because that's something that we know there's an awful lot there, and we go on digging it up. But it's also how we dig it out of the ground and the impact that it has when we are digging it out of the ground. A lot of minerals and metals come from areas which are covered in rainforest. A lot of other resources have to be dug up to be used, whether it's energy, it's water. For example, you need 20 tons of raw material just to make enough gold for a wedding ring to be dug out of the ground. In doing it, you're using cyanide, arsenic, mercury, all sorts of nasty toxic chemicals. For copper, it's 1,176 times more raw material than you actually get of useful material out of it. It's extremely destructive. So we're not just looking at throwing away and the space of where we're going to put it. We're looking at what happens at the other end too.
Okay, Rob, have you got anything you'd like to say?
My particular interest in recycling... yes, come on, clear it up, Julia, for God's sake.
Going back to my recycling.
My concern is not so much with the technicalities of recycling. There's lots of interesting life cycle analyses we can do about all these things, but my concern is more with the political or moral message. So I wonder if Thomas could elaborate on that. I mean, in Britain, it seems to me that the case for the economic or resource advantages of recycling hasn't really been made, and I think that it's actually become a real kind of issue about, you know, giving the message across that, you know, we are wasteful, and that we look at what you're throwing away. And I just wonder how that expresses itself in Germany, or does it express itself in Germany?
Okay, Thomas?
Yeah, well, am I against recycling as a principle? Yes, I am. Which includes that I want to say that, of course, human beings have always recycled materials. And still today, especially people who live in really deep poverty, are forced to recycle, or how it's called, make to to do, make do, and meant. That's, I think, a British phrase which summarizes it. But that's not what we're talking about. It is an engineering problem, or it's a technical question which has to be dealt by technicians, by engineers, what the best way is to sort out technical questions like what we're going to do with waste. But what we are living through in the last 15 years is a political campaign, and recycling has become a principle to organize society around, and I'm completely object to this. I could give you a lot of figures about how that works in Germany now, where we have built up a huge infrastructure actually to fulfill all these legislations. Though I invite you to come over to Wednesday to the place where I live in Frankfurt, where we've got a regular traffic jam every Wednesday, because it means 5 or 4 big lorries, piling up, running through the little streets and taking the little bins into their huge lorries, which is for me a metaphor for this complete obsession, and it from an economically, even from a ecological point of view, it doesn't make any sense. But most importantly, I think, what the last speaker alluded to, is this kind of moral message which goes beyond, is that you are reduced to organize your life around the idea how to separate yogurt cups from bakery bags, which I think people should have in the times we are living in better and more important things to do. And the constant message is brought home to people that actually we do too much. We are wasting energy instead of what I would argue for an open future, which actually builds on the capacity of human buildings to use more energy, to build a better future, to increase our living standards, to get on with where we are.
Okay, I'm sure you're not particularly satisfied by his answer, so would you like to come back?
Well, I don't think you've answered the point about why recycling should be bad in principle. What you seem to be talking about is household level segregation being an irritation, and as I say, I think probably few of us would argue with that. That we have another rather neat British phrase, which is waste not, want not. And if you accept, interesting giggles from the audience there, if you accept that we will have, perhaps you don't accept that we face any kind of resource problems. I'd like you to elaborate on what it is that these technical experts are going to sort out, because as far as we're concerned, it is not just the problem of getting rid of the products of consumption. It's, as Julia very neatly illustrated, what we do when we start to come up against the environment's limits for resources. And I don't just mean, and Julia did illustrate it well, I don't just mean that we will necessarily run out of things, but that we will run out of the capacity to absorb the polluting impacts of what we're doing. One of those, of course, is climate change. Maybe you don't believe in anthropomorphic climate change either, you perhaps say, but we know from many studies, certainly in this country, that we happen to give credence to, that recycling does save greenhouse gas emissions in, according to RAP, 83% of the studies they looked at. So maybe you don't believe in that either. But I'm really wondering what it is, this technical solution that's going to come forward to the fact that after 6 months, only around 2% of the resource we take from the world is still in use. So we are passing resources through at an enormously rapid rate. And I think we're fairly clear that not only can we not carry on doing that in Europe, but if the rest of the world does that too, we are all going to be in deep trouble.
Okay, Julia?
Yes, I was rather intrigued by the focus of your argument being that it was really quite onerous for us all to separate our waste and recycle our waste. But actually my experience is, and I give quite a lot of talks to sort of public talks to people, encouraging people to do something to help environmentally. And one of the things I find is recycling is actually one very concrete, one very definite, easy thing that people can do. And in that respect, it's enormously satisfying. It's amazing how people feel that at least they're doing something, because there's an awful lot of sort of, well, we want to do something, but heck, what on earth is it that we can do? And there's one thing that people know that they can do, and that is recycling. So it may seem very trivial, and in many cases it is often quite trivial. It's quite a small thing compared to some of the bigger things that people can do, but it's very tangible and it's something they can do. And the second part of that is that at the beginning, when you're changing anything, whether you're moving cutting down from this or changing your system, or, for example, in your office, using less paper or using the second side of the piece of paper, or sorting out a few more bins. I have quite a lot of bins in my house, and perhaps, if you sort of came to it for the first time and you have to start thinking about which bin everything goes into, perhaps it might seem a little onerous. But for me, it makes absolutely no difference in terms of the aggro in my life whatsoever. My life is very smooth in terms of how I handle my waste. I'm perfectly happy with it. I've got my little bins. It isn't awkward for me when I take the tinfoil off my chocolate wrappers to put it in some little bin that I've got under the sink. To do it there, and in fact it gives me quite a nice feeling. So I think that in many ways the sort of whole argument about how terrible it is and how onerous is completely wrong. It gives people a good feeling, and I think you underestimate the feel-good factor of actually individually, personally making a difference. Okay, Rob, have you got...
Well, I don't... I mean, I'm interested in the sort of the way in which Thomas has stated his views, because I don't have a principled decision about how we deal with waste, as long as we deal with it. If we remove it from my living circumstances so that I can get on with living and not have to trip over it every time, and that's kind of the irony of the way that the waste disposal issue has kind of come in Britain, is that we're now starting to see fortnightly waste collection, so people are having to deal with their disposable nappies sitting there for 2 weeks in the summer and that kind of thing. We aren't actually doing the simplest thing in relation to waste, which is to get rid of it out of our living space. I don't have a principal objection to recycling or landfill or incineration or any of these other technologies. I mean, there's pros and cons to all of them, and I don't particularly object to recycling because it's a hassle. It is a hassle. But if somebody can make a really clear case for why it's worthwhile, then like lots of other things that are a little bit of a hassle, I could maybe understand it. But I thought Julia's comments were really, really striking in this regard, because I don't have a principled decision about waste, but I certainly don't see it as an act of therapy either. I don't see, it's just about, I want to put stuff in a bin and have it disappear, and let the people who are experts in the management of waste deal with it, in whatever way they see fit. I think Thomas's point about it's a technical problem that we should leave to the technicians is a pretty good one. And I certainly disapprove of the idea that recycling becomes a kind of interactive aspect of the idea that we're screwing up the planet. It's like we're constantly reminded every time we do it, we're screwing up the planet. Paper, cardboard, plastics.
So, or we're not.
And so, just as a question for Thomas, I was wondering what's the appropriate question in terms of how we decide whether one kind of waste disposal is better than another. I mean, because it seems to me that the emphasis now, certainly in Julie and Julia's comments, is about resources and saving precious resources or preventing pollution, whereas traditionally it's been about improving productivity or doing things in the most efficient way. So I would be interested in Thomas's comments on that kind of balance between, if you like, what would be resource productivity versus labour productivity.
Yeah, Thomas?
Okay, well, just to come back to one point I raised at the beginning, because Julie said we do this and we do that. To raise it again, as a trained civil engineer, I've gone through a couple of these questions to sort out while I was studying and while I was working. And just to emphasize, again, a lot of progress we had in terms of waste management, better, more efficient, and also protecting nature waste management has nothing to do with the green movement or with the green recycling campaigns. That came out of a progress which developed at universities with scientific progress, with technological process, and having also to do, which I raised at the beginning, that a producer has to be has to calculate very, very clear how he packages a thing. Yeah? For a certain time, it might have been the best thing, or economically also the best thing to use glass for water. Nowadays you wouldn't do that. You've got a very highly efficient material being produced, which is very light, which doesn't cost a lot, which is easy to transport, and all that. So a lot of these kind of progress, which we have seen in last year, did not come from green movement. It's a big myth. It's really a big myth. You've got this myth in various discussions, like saving water. This stupid campaign about that we have to save water. Why should we? It's another discussion. Maybe we can come back on this later. But in terms of the, if you look at the figures, you know, when actually there was a decline in water usage in the household, did not come in the 70s or the 80s or the 90s when the green movement was there. It came out from technological progress itself. So there's a big myth about that. We do that and we have to do that. And to get on with it, no, I do not believe any of these apocalyptic figures you just raised about that. You know, our planet's going to be dead in a couple of years if we don't start doing this or that scheme in terms of recycling our waste. I think this is a very misanthropic, a very negative worldview, which is common sense in many circles. I completely oppose that. And actually, I would make one question I would fire back. There's one point where I would heavily argue for working out a very clever recycling technology about nuclear waste, because so far we tend to look for technical solutions to dig nuclear waste 200, 300, 400, even a kilometer down under the earth into some places where actually we never can reach again. But it's a real big source of energy. Today we don't have the technology in order to use used nuclear waste in order to get more energy out of it, but maybe we're going to have in 100 years' time or in 50 years' time. So that would be brilliant to think about now as a kind of recycling technology to get nuclear waste out again and then use it again. But exactly these kind of from my point of view, solutions which would make sense are completely opposed by the green movement in Europe and in Germany, and for the same reason, because from there you got always the simple message that the footprint of human beings on the planet is too big, that we have to reduce, we have to have less instead of more. We are to blame for that. So lowering horizons combined with a big skepticism towards modern technology.
Okay, thank you, Thomas. I'm sorry, I'm going to have to cut you short there. We don't have very much time left. If Julie and Julia would like to come back to Thomas, then I can go out to the audience for some questions. Please try and make your points as quickly as possible.
Well, I don't think there really is much point. As I say, I think if Thomas denies the idea that we are going to come up against any resource limits, there's no point debating the ins and outs of household recycling. It's as simple as that.
Okay, Julia?
Well, I think it's slightly laughable that recycling is a waste of time except for nuclear waste. I think it's very interesting. Why bother recycling nuclear waste if we shouldn't recycle anything else? It would seem fairly pointless. The other thing, just to take note of, everybody in the world creates as much waste as the average person in the UK. We'd actually need 8 worlds to support us. And I think that Thomas hasn't actually come back in any meaningful sense and actually combated the argument about the raw materials, where they come from. There is obviously a limit to them, but also digging them up causes a huge amount of damage. Do we really want to destroy the rainforest? Do we want to pollute the rivers? Do we want to turn the planet into a toxic waste dump? And do we want to use huge amounts of energy in doing it? The answer is definitely no, and the fact is that recycling makes resources more efficient and saves energy and water, which is clearly a good thing, I think.
Okay, I'm going to take some points from the audience. Can you put your hands right up? Can I take Bill at the back, please?
Well, presumably, following Julia's last point, is this on?
We can hear you.
Following Julia's last point, presumably we already need 8 Britons to live
on, which we don't. So, my problem, Julia, is my problem with your visual aid. No. My problem with your visual aid, which must go very well in the primary schools in Devon that you go to, is that it's actually entirely fallacious in terms of proportionality. The deepest well that has ever been sunk on the planet of this Earth is the equivalent thickness of putting a postage stamp on a standard-sized football. And it's also a pinprick. We haven't even started to tap into the resources that we've got. There may come a point where resource limitation will be a problem. I don't think we're even close to that yet. More importantly, what is a resource depends on our ingenuity. Uranium was not a resource to Neanderthal man, neither was aluminium, bauxite, or a load of other things. So in fact, the key resource on the planet is human inventiveness. And what you want to do with human inventiveness is flush it down the toilet, because make the one resource that's precious to all of us, which is our time, to be spent sorting out all the waste.
Okay, could I just take this gentleman down here in the green top?
Hi, directed to the lady in purple. I'm sorry, I forgot your name. It's Julia. You mentioned 3 points earlier on. Greenhouse gases, global warming, and energy. Obviously, one of the arguments for recycling is the impending oil crisis that eventually we're going to run out. And you mentioned reducing the amount of greenhouse gases emitted. Now, forgive me if I'm wrong, but I've never heard a satisfactory answer to this. We have a finite amount of fossil fuels, which represents a finite amount of carbon stored up there, which will be released if we burn it. This recycling, it's nothing more than putting a band-aid on a gaping wound in someone's chest. It's a false economy. You're looking at slowing down the release of carbon dioxide, greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, not stopping it. And until there's a completely alternative energy source that's not reliant on oil in any kind of way, the greenhouse gas global warming argument's null.
Okay, could I take this lady at the front here?
Thank you. My response to Thomas, or my question to him would be, we're talking about the UK, which is a very small island. What about you take the US? And in the US, you currently have college students who buy plastic and paper, cutlery and replacements for any kind of cooking utensil because they can't be bothered to wash up. And my response to that is it's all very well us saying, you know, it's a waste of our time recycling. But just by putting the idea in people's heads that we as human beings, and I find it very amusing that we're so arrogant in the human invention and we're so impressive as human beings that we can come up with all of these fantastic solutions. Actually, no, we can't. We have to pay attention and encourage people to not only recycle, but think about what they're buying and what they're using. And not waste, not even think about what we're doing after the fact, but what we're doing before the fact. And I think that's the message. And I worry, Thomas, that saying things like recycling is a waste of time encourages not only not recycling, but also not thinking about what we buy and how we use things before we buy them.
Okay, can I take the gentleman right at the back there with the glasses? Thank you.
It is indeed bizarre that waste has... Sorry, thank you. It is indeed bizarre that waste has become a political issue, but what's even more bizarre is that it's also become a commodity that is now traded around the world. In the world of carbon offsetting and carbon trading, which are kind of the bastard sons of recycling, the West now trades in waste with the third world. So, for example, you can now pay Indian farmers to use ploughs instead of machines, and then you own the carbon that they save, and you can use it on flights to Barbados and all sorts of other nice, relaxing things. Companies are now taking part in carbon trading with third world companies, so that they encourage people in the third world to use more primitive forms of machinery and so on, so that they can kind of use the carbon over here to be more advanced. So I just wonder if Julie and Julia would accept that the politicization of waste and this idea that there's a finite amount of resources has created this situation where effectively the West, the third world, lives in shit on our behalf.
Okay, I will come back out for another round of questions, but I'm going to ask our panel to respond as quickly as they can.
Well, as you rightly say, the third world lives in shit on our behalf because our consumption is propped up largely by a lot of the very cheap inputs of goods that we get from other countries, and their environmental effects are borne by them, not by us. Now, you may want to argue that's fine, it's up for their governments to deal with, but in a globalised economy, and I don't know if the gentleman who talked about we don't need 8 UKs has noticed, but we are living in a globalised economy. So we're talking about global impacts here. And however much you think these things may be isolatable to the UK or Germany or China or whatever else, we only have to look at what happens to global finance to understand that's not the case. And however much you don't believe in, say, climate change, you bet your life the insurance industry does after some of what has happened Indeed. But climate change effects could bring down the global insurance industry, which in turn will bring down our financial system. That's how interdependent we now are. Now, you may choose to believe that or not believe it, or decide that cycling of resources or whatever has any relevance. I kind of agree with the chap here who says that this is a band-aid on a problem in terms of climate change and fossil fuels. You're probably very right about that. The fact is nobody has accepted, although I get hints The Economist is pretty much accepting that we've reached peak oil and something else needs to happen, if only for reasons of scarcity, never mind the carbon emissions. And maybe we have different energy sources. But in the meantime, if a bit of fairly sensible cycling of aluminium saves 95% of the energy that you take to make new aluminium, why not do it? You know, why is that not at least some form of common sense? Carbon offsetting is a completely different argument. I think that's not relevant. But I am staggered, actually, by the parochial nature of some of these comments, that we don't live in a globalised, interdependent world that is going to suffer. I feel sorry for your children, is all I can say.
Okay. Julia, if you'd like to say a few words.
Well, I'm rather intrigued by the fact that our inventiveness has got to be used in terms of sort of digging deeper and deeper into the earth, and in finding more and different resources and changing things at a very fundamental level, when perhaps our inventiveness could be used to sort out some of the logistical issues in terms of recycling, to make it a little bit easier, perhaps more convenient, so people don't think it's such a hassle. And then we can, for example, save the 95% of energy for aluminium, or the 75% for recycling iron, and 75% for recycling plastic, rather than having to go and find new and better things. And I think that it's really important not to forget this point about where do these resources come from. One of the points about oil is whether it is or isn't going to run out, and the whole peak oil issue is it's coming from more and more inaccessible and difficult places. And what does that mean? It means a huge disruption of ecosystems, wildlife, and lovely, beautiful, pristine environments. Now, some people who think it's a real hassle to recycle might think it's not worth saving all those things. Personally, I value those systems, and I think it's worth doing a little bit to reduce the amount of waste that we have and to make the most of whatever it is that we are going to use.
Okay, Rob, can you...
I thought the contribution at the front here, I think, really summed up the two different positions, I think, that are going on here. You say we should, whenever we use something, we should say, should I be using this? I think that's effectively what you're saying. Should I be doing this thing? And whereas I'm thinking, how can I do that? How can we do more of this? How can we do this without, more cheaply, so that we can have more wealth, we're more comfortable, and get more bangs for our bucks in terms of resources, extract more resources or get better use out of them. Basically, how can we overcome the problems as they arise from the problem of development? That's a kind of problem-solving attitude which allows us to have more of everything while not screwing up the earth. I mean, I don't want to screw up the earth. But that's the difference in attitude that's going on here. Between you're saying we should stop now and in fact retreat, and I'm saying actually we can all be wealthier. Why should people in the developing world carry on living in poverty? We need more wealth for them as much as anybody else. So everybody should have this standard of living at the very minimum. So how do we do that? That's the question. It's not an easy question to answer, but that's the question we should be asking.
Okay, hands right up in the audience. Can I start with this gentleman at the front, please?
Yeah, there seems to be a confusion in what you're saying.
Julia,
you represent various corporations, right? Or you work?
I don't represent anybody except myself, but I do work for all sorts of different companies. Marks and Spencer, Morrison's, Procter & Gamble.
Yeah, I was bringing it up because in America, where I come from, greenwashing is the word we use for people like McDonald's use. Well, someone like you probably.
Okay.
But when you say use of resources, that seems to be a rather different situation than recycling, because you're talking now about saving the rainforest. That's consumption of timber. Conversion of timber
not just timber, also minerals and metals.
Yeah, well, let's stay with timber for a minute. So they cut down the trees so they can grow soybeans on the pasture. That's not a question of recycling. That's just a debate about resources. I don't see why you seem to be confusing the two things. Recycling, I think the argument would be, is it a purely tokenistic effort which doesn't address the real use of resources? I mean, I tend to agree with the gentleman from Germany, except I was surprised by one thing he said. We said, leave it to the engineers. Now, to leave it as a technical problem, the engineers at Hanford Nuclear Reservation in the state of Washington said it's really safe to produce uranium in Hanford. Actually, now it's soaking into the ground and it's going into the Columbia River. So I don't think it's a very good, smart plan to say leave it to the engineers, although I completely agree with you that there's a latent Puritanism to do with recycling, which I think is ridiculous.
Okay, please keep your points short. Can I take that guy standing up, please?
Well, just when we're talking latent Puritanism, I just want to ask Julia that, you know, are you really saying that since you're so keen on global governance and everything, and you think we're also parochial?
Sorry, is you talking to Julie?
Well, I'm getting mixed up between the Julie and the Julians,
yeah, okay.
But maybe I'm not alone in that. Julie, you know, I think some of the people here have, you know, gone outside Britain, actually, despite your condescension. And I want to say, do you really think we should set an example in England to the Chinese and give it, you know, stop wearing wedding rings? And do you think that the Chinese should be allowed or not allowed to wear wedding rings? If you think they should not be allowed, how would you go about doing the global governance in Shanghai and Beijing to prevent Chinese people marrying and having some romance in their lives?
Okay, can I take that guy there? Yep, him. Thank you.
Hi. Going back to what Julia was saying before about how recycling isn't in the least bit onerous or unctuous. For me, what you're describing highlights what is the most worrying thing for me about this whole idea of environmentalism, and that's the metaphysical nature of the whole proposition. And what you were describing had, for me, a striking similarity to the votive behaviour that you would take part in, having subscribed to a particular religion. And it wouldn't be in the least bit unctuous or in the least bit difficult or onerous if you believed that the behaviour that you were taking part in was alleviating you of the guilt that you're supposed to accept, that we're all supposed to accept as being selfish consumers. For me, the idea that we all have to accept this dogma is kind of shown in the behaviour that we're expected to participate in. That is the votive behaviour of a religion.
Okay, I'd like that guy at the back, and then this lady here, this gentleman down here, and I think that's all we're going to have time for, I'm afraid.
Yeah, is that on? Yeah, yeah, Stuart Waiton. I also feel sorry for my children, especially my son, who's on his eco committee in his school. And I do wonder, I mean, and whatever the state of play is with global warming and the solutions to these things. I mean, one of the things that happened with my son, who's 8 years old now, was that he was in a bit of a panic. He comes home and tries to lecture me about why I shouldn't drive or why I shouldn't turn on lights and things like that, much to my annoyance. But he also thought that the reason the planet was heating up was because the sun was getting too close to the earth. Now, a concern I have, not only in the framework of children, a kind of Orwellian children hectoring their parents about recycling, etc. It's fine, if you want to have a debate with adults, let's have a debate with adults, but the fact that this comes through school, and it seems quite problematic to me that children of 6, 7, 8 years old are getting a kind of an education, if you like, about ideas that they clearly cannot grasp. And I'd like to know what you think about that, whether you think that this is a positive thing, that small children are being engaged and involved in this debate, not only in relation to their parents, but in terms of their own capacity to understand extremely complex issues, I think is very problematic. So, yes, I'm glad you are concerned about my children, because I am too.
Okay, this lady here. Thank you.
Because of the influence of green ideas. And my son's first school trip was to the local recycling dump, which is 50 yards from the school and 50 yards from our house. We regularly go there in order to get rid of rubbish from our house. He doesn't need to go there with the school. This was 2 years ago. He goes back after half-term on Monday. It's book week. guess what the theme of Book Week is, because it coincides with Environment Week. The theme of Book Week is the environment. Quite which books they'll find, I don't know, I hate to think. The second school trip he'll ever go on is also going to be a trip to the recycling dump. The same recycling dump that he goes to most Saturdays to get rid of lots of stuff from our house. Now, I feel sorry for children being inculcated with that view of humanity, which is limited to the 50 yards around their house, and the global view of humanity, which is that we are a pollutant on the planet. And I feel sorry for my children because of the influence of people like you.
Okay, lastly, this gentleman down here. Please keep it very short. Please keep it very short. Thank you.
Yeah. I went to our municipal dump or recycling centre a few weeks ago to get rid of a few boxes of unwanted literature. And I was amazed. This was a Sunday afternoon, and I was absolutely amazed at the numbers there. There were hundreds of people, a queue to get in, far more people than you would have seen going to church that morning. And I watched them taking apart their household rubbish, separating the cardboard to go in one skip and the plastic to go in another skip, and so on and so on. And I thought, people used to criticise the churches for engaging in meaningless rituals, but the most arcane rituals of the Byzantine church couldn't approach this. Now, I was talking to a friend the next day who said she'd been at her recycling centre one day when the lorry arrived to collect all the skips of glass, and it picked up the green glass and the white glass and the brown glass, and it tipped them all into the back of the same lorry. Now, I'm sure the people who separated these bottles felt good about it, just as Julia felt good about separating out her sweetie wrappers and putting them in a separate bin. And I've got no problem about people going through rituals that make them feel good about themselves and give their lives a sense of meaning and so on. What I've got a problem with is when they use public policy and legislation to force the rest of us to go through these faith-based rituals when we don't share the faith.
Okay, I'm going to ask our respondents to sum up in reverse order. So starting with Rob, please.
All right, very quickly. My brother used to work for the evil empire, also known as Tesco, and he told me that actually Tesco make money out of recycling their cardboard. When the wagons go to the branches, they dump off all the goods, and then they take on all the cardboard boxes, bring them back centrally, and then somebody picks them up from the central depot, this huge quantity of cardboard, and they recycle it. So Tesco recycle about 80% of their cardboard, and that makes sense. I think in certain circumstances, recycling that kind of thing makes sense because you've got a lot of it in one place, so the economies of scale are huge, and that's perfect sense. Us recycling one yogurt pot and 2 aluminium cans and this week's newspapers doesn't make economic sense. And I think that's the difference. If it doesn't make economic sense, why are we doing it? And I think that can only really be because of the moral message that lies underneath it, which is a point that people have made throughout the audience.
Okay, Julia?
It's quite difficult to know where to start, actually. I thought I'd just address this point about the fact that I was confused about the rainforest because you were trying to sort of channel me into the timber in the rainforest, and if you noticed, I was very specifically just pointing out that a lot of metals come from areas that are covered in rainforests. So digging up the metals means that you are destroying parts of the rainforest. But it's very relevant to recycling because I clearly haven't understood the point that I was making is that if you recycle resources, you are using them more efficiently. So you are making more out of what you're getting out of the ground. So I don't think that's too difficult to understand. And it's the same with wedding rings. Of course, nobody's trying to ban anybody from doing something. What you're trying to do is say, let's make the most of the resources that we are digging out of things because digging them out of the ground is having an impact. Processing them into whatever end product is having a process, let's make the most of it, not just chuck it away and start again and dig bigger and bigger and deeper holes. And in relation to our children, I think it's absolutely fascinating that everyone's so concerned about their children learning about a very significant issue that's likely to affect their future. And I think it's amazing the idea that it's so complex that we shouldn't talk to them about it. Isn't that what education is about, is explaining the issues and what's going on in the world? And if the issue is so complicated, should we just ignore anything that's too complicated for any of these children to understand and forget about educating them at all? I think that's the biggest nonsense I've ever heard.
Well, I suspect you, gentlemen on the end, hit the nail on the head when you talked about faith, that it does it seems to me come down to an act of faith, whether anyone is prepared to accept that we will face resource problems, a bit like whether we have hit peak oil or we are going to run out of things, or these things exist. But even economists accept that the environment is treated as an externality, which means it's not factored into the marketplace. It's too late to get into an economic debate, which is a shame, because I think that's where the heart of it is. But if you're not prepared to accept, and I suppose my problem is I've been too immersed in the literature of global doom, and maybe I should find something better to do, because I suspect I'd be a lot happier and I wouldn't fear for the future of... well, I'm sorry, I seriously do fear for the future of my two sons who are 8 and 10. I would love not to. I would really love not to. But I do this kind of work because the ingenuity point is very relevant, actually. It should not be beyond our collective wit to do these things differently. But there are no economic incentives to do things differently. So instead of... I'm just a great shame today, we've spent having a very shallow libertarian debate about the rights and wrongs of washing yogurt cups, when actually the debate we should be having is about whether our economic system could better drive the ingenuity that Rob wants to carry on living a nice, comfortable life. Who of us doesn't want to live a comfortable life? But personally, I don't want my comfortable life to result in a shit future for my children. So I think the point about an act of faith has probably hit the nail on the head.
Okay, Thomas, to bring you back in.
Great. Well, I also think it's not too complex issue to discuss with a kid. I've got a 7-year-old daughter, and actually we have a lot of fun every Wednesday when these 5 lorries come along, and so you can have actually quite interesting discussion also with kids about that, and make them, or show them, explain them what an absurd situation that is. Leave it to engineers, yes, but of course embedded in some kind of regulation process, like it was is done. But I'm arguing against having waste as a political campaign in society, and trying to organize citizens around separating their waste. On this nuclear waste, which has been raised again by Julia, I gave that as an example where, of course, recycling can make sense, and it should be recycled where it makes sense. And for me, it would make sense to keep nuclear waste resources open for the future when we've got better technologies, as it probably makes sense to recycle metal, or make sure that batteries or chemicals are not just thrown into the Thames or another river. But we are not talking about. We're talking about a political campaign that has been installed in Western Europe, and is trying to actually relocate your interest and around the most banal things. Yeah, actually, we should be happy to get rid of it. We should be happy to live in a civilized world where we have not to think about our waste. I mean, that was a big progress for humanity. Actually, get rid of these fundamental stupid question to sort out every day and every morning and every night. On this students in America, well, I've never been at a campus in the States, but I can say congratulations to these students that are not worried about it. Get on with their studies and do the serious work, which doesn't mean that we, of course, as humanity, as human beings, we have responsibility for how we behave, what we do, but the question is, what kind of questions do you raise? And that is an open question. Everybody has to answer it for himself. Is it the biggest question you should have in your mind, thinking about where to put your waste on, or is there some more important questions maybe while you are studying which you should raise? On the question on resource limits and better technologies, of course, some resources come, they go, we discover new ones, and so on. Technologies have to become better in all kind of aspects, waste management included. But the basic question is, what mindset does a society need in order to come up with such progressive developments, better technologies, find new limits, new resources, actually to have a better world, to rise living standard. And the mindset which has been described here on this recycling business is exactly opposing further progress, is actually telling people we need less, we have gone too far, the human species is actually polluting the planet, and actually the only thing we can do is separating waste and hope that somehow we're going to survive the next 50 or 60 years. So finally, which I find most striking actually is even if you would start the discussion on a technical level about waste management, all the targets which are outlined again and again, sometimes, or 10 years ago, today is the greenhouse gas and climate change. 10 years ago it was acid rain, it was the forest dying out and so on. If you only need the technical reality, you realize all the targets the green movement is putting forward, they don't work. It's the complete opposite, you know. Waste recycling in the way we do it in Germany and Britain is opting for is a waste of energy, is a waste of money, it's a waste of resources. It costs. It's about 10 times more expensive energy using than you just throw it away.
It's just
That's,
not true.
That is
it's just
true.
Not true.
So actually, the facts, you know, they don't fit, and then you have to ask why is it? And I believe it's only about promoting a very negative, a very misanthropic ethic in society, which I completely oppose.
Okay, I'd like to thank our panel.